carrying on talking about why disorders may carry on existing through evolution despite not having any real advantage to the person carrying the disorder, or having a disorder, I should say. So then I came across this article. It's called Understanding Evolution, and by someone called Berkeley, not Berkeley I mentioned in the other video, a different one, and it's spelled differently as well. It's Berkeley. So it talks about deleterious genes. It says we would expect natural selection to remove genes with negative effects, as individuals who carry those genes would not reproduce as much, so the genes should not be passed on. And yet, we see cases where this expectation is not met. So why? So there are several possibilities here. Number one, something called a I'm probably not pronouncing this word correctly. It's a long word. Heterozygote advantage. When carrying 2 copies of a gene is disadvantageous, but carrying only 1 copy is advantageous. As I mentioned previously, that's the case with sickle cell anemia. Natural selection will not remove the gene from the population. The advantage conferred in its heterozygous state keeps the gene around. Number 2, it may not really reduce fitness. Some genetic disorders only exert effects later in life, after reproduction has taken place. Or it may be maintained by mutation. Mutation may keep arising in a population even as selection weeds it out. And indeed, that has actually been shown to be the case with ADHD. We'll get on to that later. Real evidence, not pop science. Real evidence actually shows this with ADHD. So we'll be getting on to the real evidence about that later, because this does apply to ADHD. May be maintained by mutation. Mutation may keep arising in a population even as selection weeds it out. So we'll be getting on to that. And and then also some more information here. Over time, as generations of individuals with the trait continue to reproduce, the advantageous trait becomes increasingly common. For other harmful traits, a phenomenon called reduced penetrance, in which some individuals with a disease associated variant do not show the signs and symptoms, can also allow genetic variations to be passed to future generations. So that's reduced penetrance. That kind of does happen with autism and ADHD, reduced penetrance, because as you know, many people carry these genes and do not have autism or ADHD, or they might show such slight traits that it's not causing them a problem. When there's so many genes dispersed through the population, it's obvious they're going to get passed down, not because having a disorder is an evolutionary advantage. I mean, who could have thought that one up? But but just simply because, you know, these genes are widely dispersed through the population, so lots and lots and lots of people carry them, these genes, and do just fine in life and reproduce and don't have a disorder, but pass, or they might just have a very low level of traits that don't actually cause any significant problems. So obviously, if they're going to get passed down, doesn't mean that those traits themselves are any advantage. That's just hypothetical speculation. And science is not based on speculation, it's based on evidence. Okay, so that was that article. And I'll be getting on to the nuts and bolts of what Russell Berkeley has to say on it, but I'll probably have to do that in another video, because that's quite a lot of information. I think I will probably get on to Berkeley's article in another video, but I just wanted to just reflect a bit on the Guardian article, and just to put some problems with it out there before we get on to Berkeley's critique. So first of all, most things don't exist for an evolutionary reason, let alone an advantage. Most things just are. They don't prevent you from reproducing. So, if we're talking about ADHD, you're not autism here, although the same things can apply to autism. ADHD per se does not stop someone from reproducing. So most people with ADHD do reach adulthood, although it does carry a high mortality, and there's actually quite a significant number of children with ADHD who end up dying because of risk-taking or impulsivity or whatever. But the facts remain that most people with ADHD do reach adulthood, and many of them do reproduce. Aside from the fact, as I said earlier, many people might carry a high number of these risk genes, might have subclinical traits, not to the point of disorder, and likewise, and they're even more likely to reproduce. So you can see how, it doesn't, it's not like something that's so severe that everyone with it tends to die off before they get to reproduction age. So that's one reason why it stands to reason these genes are going to carry on, even though they're not actually an advantage. The other thing is that these papers always use hyper-focus on something useful, like, for example, stocking food or gathering herbs, and not something completely useless, like organising all the rocks in order of colour, or watching the clouds move for 3 hours. It's also a very artificial study because, of course, it's done in a lab, and it's a computer game, for crying out loud. Many people with ADHD, there's a high correlation between ADHD and computer games. Many of these people taking part in this study will be highly used to playing computer games. We don't know how often they've played games before. They might be very used to certain types of games, like involving strategy and things like that, highly practiced. It's not a real-world study. You can't take the results from a lab study and say that this is applicable to a hunter-gatherer environment, for crying out loud. I mean, to do an actual, more realistic study, you'd have to actually replicate hunter-gatherer conditions. So how far can we actually really replicate this in the wild, And they haven't done a study replicating it in the wild. That has yet to be done. And I did actually mention that as one of the limitations in the study. And also, many people with ADHD can barely spend 20 minutes typing out, a form or something like that. Do you really think that they would have the focus to spend 4 hours, 14 hours, or however long it takes, making a rope? Sometimes the trait is just a glitch, and it sticks around because it's not quite enough of a problem to get selected against. I mean, if you think about it, picking berries is a pretty boring task and it takes forever. But that's not what the participants were doing. They were picking berries in a computer for 8 minutes. It's not exactly replicating real-world conditions. A computer simulation isn't real life. People with ADHD are frequently drawn to computer games, as I've just said, and 8 minutes isn't a long time for an adult to get bored of a novel game. No game can capture the complexity of nomadic life. And the other issue of this study, of course, is that these were not diagnosed people. They simply scored highly on a screening test. That is not the same thing as a medical diagnosis. Many of these people may well have just had higher than average levels of traits without necessarily having a disorder. There's a big difference between having a high level of traits and having an actual medical disorder. So until they've actually compared it with people who actually do have a disorder, it's hard to say to what extent this transfers across to people with an actual disorder. And the other issue as well is their selection process. Who were screened out from this study? Because it actually said that people who were screened out who didn't understand the instructions. Well, that's telling you something, because people with ADHD, a lot of them are going to struggle with attention. So those with more severe issues may well not have understood what was expected of them, and they did not take part in this study. So already you're going to get a very high functioning group of people who can do this sort of study in the first place. That is not representative of the majority of people with ADHD. So those are the main issues, really. You know, to what extent can you is this applicable in the real world outside of a computer test? To what extent does this apply to actually diagnose people with ADHD? Selection bias. Are we seeing here that people who love computer games are going to take part in this type of study? And the very fact is, we don't know what happened all those many years ago and how people with ADHD cope. But I can tell you one thing: based upon what we do know of ADHD and autism, people with actual debilitating ADHD, the disorder, probably would not have survived.